In the twilight of his life, Meyer Lansky found himself perched atop an empire of shadows, his power stretching across borders, seas, and, most importantly, across the unspoken understanding of the American government. The territory he held wasn't merely a piece of real estate. It was a vast expanse of influence, secured not just by muscle, but by an intricate web of ties that reached into the heart of U.S. intelligence. The FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, the U.S. Navy, even the newly minted Central Intelligence Agency. They all had vested interests in Lansky. He wasn't just a mobster anymore. He was a trusted, albeit unsanctioned asset, a man who could move arms, clean dirty money, and gather intelligence without leaving fingerprints. Yet, as Lansky tightened his grip on this delicate balance of crime and cooperation, the underworld around him began to shudder. The cracks first appeared with the murder of Willie Moretti, an outspoken boss who had defended Costello and the old ways, but who had, in the end, become a liability. Moretti's death left Frank Costello exposed, shouldering burdens he had long avoided. For Lansky, too, it was a signal, a reminder that the tide was turning. The Kefauver hearings thundered through organized crime, exposing shadows to daylight, dragging syndicate bosses into the limelight. While Lansky stayed largely untouched, his associates bore the brunt, and in response, Lansky began shifting his operations offshore, eyeing Havana's tropical promise. Cuba's doors opened wide for Lansky. The island needed mafia money to fuel its development, and Lansky, seeing the potential for casinos, nightclubs, and lucrative ventures, moved his operation with clinical precision. Meyer Lansky was the undisputed kingpin of Cuba, the ultimate shot caller who turned the island into his glittering underworld paradise. But Lansky's reign didn't begin in a vacuum. Long before he and Lucky Luciano set their sights on Havana, there was another power already embedded in the island's shadowy criminal fabric, a family whose roots run deep in Cuba's illicit trade. That family was the Trafficantes, a dynasty of quiet but ruthless operators who had laid claim to the territory long before Lansky and his men even stepped off the boat. The Trafficantes had been woven into Cuba's underworld tapestry for as long as anyone could remember. They weren't outsiders. They spoke the language fluently, understood the nuances of the culture, and had a deep knowledge of the island's turbulent history. They knew the key players in its political unrest, understood the simmering rage among Cuban exiles, and had mapped out every corner where plots were hatched, meetings were held, and weapons exchanged. Santo Trafficante Jr. and his family didn't just operate in Cuba. They owned it in ways that even Meyer Lansky couldn't match. Their connections were organic, born of blood and history, stretching across the Gulf Coast into Tampa, Florida. Tampa, especially the immigrant-rich enclave of Ybor City, was the lifeline between Cuba and the States. Since the 1890s, Ybor City was an enclave for Southern Mafia men like the New Orleans Mafia and Santo Trafficante Sr., and it had been a sanctuary for Cuban exiles, a hive of political scheming where revolutionaries whispered over cigars and café con leche. Ybor's streets had hosted legends like José Martí, the fiery intellectual who spearheaded Cuba's fight for independence from Spain. In 1893, Martí himself became the target of an assassination plot. 2 Spanish agents had planned to poison him, a scheme that went disastrously wrong. In a moment of saintly magnanimity, Martí saved his would-be killers from an enraged mob and even forgave them. In a twist so surreal it could only be Cuban, the 2 assassins turned loyalists, joining Martí's cause and dying beside him 2 years later on Cuban soil. By the 1950s, these revolutionary embers were glowing hot once again. Earlier in the 50s, Fidel Castro, fresh from the mountains, needed arms and allies, and he knew where to go. Florida, with its historical bond to the Cuban struggle, became his staging ground. Castro's emissaries spoke to the exiled communities who had long histories of resistance, tapping into networks that had shipped arms and planned insurrections for decades. In a cruel irony, the same corridors trafficked in rebellion and oppression, with organized crime figures like Trafficante brokering deals, supplying weapons, and playing both sides of the bloody game. Coming into the mid-50s, a select few figures were as primed to ride the wave of opportunity as Santo Trafficante Jr., the mob boss, with a burgeoning empire poised to exploit Cuba's warm welcome to U.S. investment under Batista. Yet, by the summer of 1954, just as Havana's peak season beckoned, two seismic events jolted Trafficante's seemingly unshakable dominion. First, the death of his father, Santo Trafficante Sr., the stalwart patriarch of Tampa's Sicilian community, cast a heavy shadow over his son's rise. Diagnosed years prior with stomach cancer, the elder Trafficante passed away on August 11th at 68, a loss as unexpected as it was destabilizing for Santo Jr., who had meticulously taken the reins of the family business over the past several years. In Mafia tradition, the death of a founding figure often triggered bloody power struggles, a scenario that Santo Jr. knew could ignite Tampa's fierce bolita racket, the cornerstone of their empire. But Tampa's streets remained quiet, a testament to the ironclad respect held for Trafficante Sr., regarded as a founding father in the city's Sicilian community. His influence was a near-mythic constant, his presence iconic at the Nebraska Avenue bar he operated, where backroom dealings and cash counting were woven into the fabric of daily life. Soft-spoken and careful, Trafficante Sr. maintained an unassailable public image despite his unspoken underworld ties. Although he was widely known as the patriarch of Tampa's most notorious underworld family, he had built a reputation as a community pillar, holding memberships in Tampa's top fraternal organizations and dying with a spotless criminal record, no arrests, no jail time. At his funeral, the power of his legacy was undeniable. Under a searing August sun, more than 500 mourners gathered in Tampa's L'Unione Italiana cemetery, the immaculately kept final resting place for many Sicilian immigrants. Santo Jr., now the unchallenged heir at 39, stood amid a crowd sprinkled with the notorious faces of Tampa's underworld, bidding his father farewell. Interred in a solid brass coffin, Trafficante Sr. was laid to rest in a marble crypt, adorned with the only known photograph of the man whose influence had defined a generation. His modest estate, valued at just over $36,000, concealed a legacy of Cuban contacts and empire-building tactics that had yet to reveal their true worth. For Santo Jr., there was little time to grieve. Even as his father's remains were laid to rest, he faced indictment on gambling charges, a headache that had first surfaced months earlier when he and 34 others were swept up in a Tampa-wide crackdown. The spotlight on the Trafficante family was unrelenting, following the explosive Kefauver hearings that had branded Tampa as the hellhole of the Gulf Coast. Reformist fervor surged through law enforcement circles. According to local estimates, Tampa's Mafia raked in an eye-watering $5 million a year from the bolita racket alone. One ambitious sheriff, seizing on this atmosphere, spent over 18 months building a case against Trafficante's enterprise, and for the first time, a member of the Trafficante family was brought to trial. Santo Jr. secured the services of Frank Regano, a young, relatively green attorney with Sicilian roots. Though untested, Regano quickly struck up a bond with his client. In his memoir, Mob Lawyer, he recalled the boss as a man far removed from the usual rough bolita bookies he defended. Trafficante could have passed for a bank executive or an Italian diplomat, Regano wrote, impressed by the mobster's tailored attire and refined demeanor. Their professional relationship deepened as Regano's salary swelled from $10,000 to an impressive $140,000, fueled by his steady defense work for the Trafficante syndicate. When he expressed unease over the cash-stuffed envelopes Trafficante used to settle his fees, a senior partner in his firm laughed, explaining that this was the only way mob clients paid, with no paper trail. Regano had entered a new world, one where the unconventional was the rule. Come fall of 1954, Mangano had a slew of victories to his name. Most of his 28 clients walked free, acquitted or exonerated on appeal. Pleased but unrelenting, Trafficante advised Mangano to elevate his appearance, recommending a Miami tailor and suggesting a stylish barber and a manicurist. When it came time for Santo and his brother Henry's trial, Mangano played a spectator role, watching as their case was managed by Pat Whitaker, a renowned defense attorney. The state's case rested heavily on testimony from a detective who alleged bribery attempts by Henry, aiming to buy protection from police raids. But a critical error in the prosecutor's closing argument, drawing attention to the brothers' decision not to testify, violated procedural law, leading to a quick reversal of their convictions. The victory party at Santo's favorite restaurant in Ybor City became the setting for a personal promotion. Santo informed Mangano that he, not Whitaker, would henceforth be his lead counsel. In time, Mangano came to suspect that Santo had orchestrated the prosecutor's blunder, yet another example of the mobster's deft manipulation of the system. But victory came at a cost. The Kefauver hearings had tarnished Trafficante's name and brought unprecedented exposure to his syndicate. Legal bills mounted, and the Bolita racket, the financial lifeline of the Trafficante empire, looked increasingly vulnerable to the reformist push. By December, Santo sought solace in Cuba, returning to the island paradise that had become his lifeline. Havana had once been an added indulgence, but now, like Lansky before him, Trafficante saw it as his sanctuary, a land where profits were safeguarded by a government that welcomed gangsters with open arms. With American law breathing down his neck and reformists gunning for his Bolita operations, the Pearl of the Antilles was no longer just a business. It was salvation, his chance to heal his empire's wounds in a place where power was bought, sold, and embraced at the highest levels. Meanwhile, back in New York, Joe Adonis, one of Luciano's most trusted allies, faced his own battle with the government. He lied to investigators, claiming his birthplace was American soil. But the lie didn't last. Once exposed, Adonis was given the grim choice: prison or exile. To avoid the brutal fate of incarceration, he reluctantly chose Milan, Italy, leaving a vacancy that rattled Luciano's old empire. When Luciano was imprisoned, the empire he had built began fracturing. Thomas Dewey, with the full weight of Roosevelt's administration behind him, targeted Luciano relentlessly. With the fall of Dutch Schultz, his rackets were scattered among Vito Genovese, Tommy Lucchese, and the Profaci family. And with Lepke Buchalter's empire similarly sliced up, territories were divided, handed over to the Mangano brothers, who were murdered at the start of the 50s, and their rackets consumed by Scalise, Gambino and Anastasia, Costello, Genovese, Lucchese, and other powerful players. Dewey's tenacity drove Costello south, pushing him into Louisiana, while Lansky laid his stakes in Cuba, and Benjamin Siegel found new ground in California. But without men like Red Levine, Adonis, and Tommy Lucchese, Luciano's empire would soon begin to fray at the edges. Joe Adonis, Meyer Lansky and Costello did their best to maintain Luciano's interests, but with Luciano's 1946 deportation, his control, once ironclad, began to slip. Frank Costello was now immersed in high society, mingling with elites, attending political fundraisers, distancing himself from the gritty streets that had built him. Costello believed himself above the fray, a boardroom gangster. But that detachment created a dangerous void. His refusal to involve himself in the narcotics trade and his preference for mingling with political elites left his empire vulnerable. A prime illustration of this detachment from the streets was Paul Castellano, the so-called boss of bosses, who lived in a sprawling white mansion on Staten Island, a far cry from the gritty world of the men who earned for him. Castellano had become insulated, demanding more money from his soldiers while offering them less in return, all while making questionable concessions to rivals like the Lucchese crime family. He missed the simmering discontent beneath him, underestimated the ambitions of his subordinates, and, worst of all, allowed his power base to crumble. When his heavy hitters, men like the ruthless Roy de Mayo, were eliminated, Castellano was left exposed, a king with no dangerous knights. The same could be said for Frank Costello, who had also retreated to the comforts of a lavish mansion. Costello had grown detached from the street-level pulse of the mafia. He openly disapproved of narcotics, clinging to a bygone era when gambling and bootlegging were the lifeblood of the underworld. But he could sense the tide was turning. The old ways were dying, and a new breed of gangster was rising, hungry, ruthless, and willing to embrace the narcotics trade that Costello so despised. To these upstarts, drugs were the new prohibition, an opportunity too lucrative to ignore, just as Costello himself had once viewed bootlegging as his golden ticket. The difference was stark. Costello saw the writing on the wall but couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't, adapt. Castellano, blinded by his own arrogance, never even saw it coming. In the end, both men were casualties of a shifting underworld, yet their fates diverged. One lived, fading quietly into obscurity, while the other died, his reign ending in a hail of bullets on a cold Manhattan street. Their time was over, swept away by the rising tide of a new breed of gangster. This new era wasn't built on the old codes of loyalty or respect. Adonis had been Costello's firewall, the one who managed street-level responsibilities, while Costello mingled with politicians, but with Adonis now facing deportation, cracks were widening. When the Mangano brothers fell, Albert Anastasia ascended, a wild card among gangsters, a man whose ruthlessness and unpredictability made him a force unlike any other. Anastasia ruled with an iron fist, a dangerous relic in a world that was modernizing without him. As the new underworld shifted, Anastasia's volatility added a tremor to each criminal venture. Meanwhile, with the deportation of Joe Adonis looming, Lansky and Costello saw the writing on the wall. The age of calm, calculated operations was over. A new era, one of shifting allegiances and ruthless power grabs, had arrived, reshaping organized crime, with Lansky steering his gaze further from America's shores, ever toward the promise of empire beyond its reach. By the time Joe Adonis was ordered deported, he knew he had to act fast. He needed a base of operations outside the United States, one with both privacy and access. Switzerland, with its impenetrable banking secrecy, seemed like the answer. It was Meyer Lansky who had originally planted the idea in Luciano, as well as Adonis's mind. Use Swiss accounts, move funds without a trace, loan money back to yourself. Lansky had already set the example, and soon Adonis was on a plane to Zurich, where he planned to deposit a fortune for safekeeping. For years, Luciano had been getting a regular sum of $25,000 monthly from his American associates, but it wasn't enough. Despite his attempt to maintain a modest lifestyle, the expenses were mounting in Italy. Charlie wanted more, to invest in businesses, to fund charitable works, even to aid his local community. Italy's citizens respected him, partly because he avoided the narcotics trade and prostitution, engaging only in small, benign rackets that brought in goods for the people. But it was Luciano's acts of charity that made him a legend. He donated medicines, food, and household supplies at fair prices, and he worked tirelessly to raise funds for a local hospital. Each night, Luciano returned home disheartened, his wife playfully reminding him that noble work was hard, especially without his gangster tactics. She teased, "Maybe in a few days I'll forget your promise. Go protect a few millionaires, play Robin Hood, and maybe someday they'll talk about how you raised money for the clinic for the poor by protecting the rich." Luciano's frustration simmered, particularly knowing that his men in America were becoming richer by the day while he scraped by. The nagging thought that his family in New York was minting money under his blueprint while he himself lived modestly tore at him. When he found himself down to a mere $100,000 in Switzerland, and Adonis showed up with a suitcase of $3 million, Luciano's patience snapped. Meeting at Zurich airport, Luciano watched Adonis deposit his small fortune. Furious, he cornered Adonis, demanding to know why his friend had so much wealth while Luciano was struggling to make ends meet. Adonis shrugged off the accusation, insisting that the money was his personal savings. "That's bullshit," Luciano fired back. "I started you. Don't you remember who put you up in Philly? Who gave you that first role with Waxy Gordon?" Adonis, calm as ever, replied, "Maybe you did, Charlie, but you can't break me." 30 years of friendship went down the drain in that moment, and Luciano knew he could never trust Adonis again. When he returned to Naples, he wrote to Lansky, demanding answers. Within weeks, Lansky himself arrived, explaining that Adonis had been preparing for the worst, stashing his earnings away in case he had to leave the States. Luciano listened, but the explanation left a bitter taste. Though he trusted Lansky, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. In the shadowy world Luciano had built, trust was rare, and betrayal cut deep. What had once been an ironclad alliance now felt fragile, like a web where loyalty could unravel with the pull of a single thread. Adonis's duplicity haunted him, and every return to Zurich became a reminder of the fractured loyalty between them. His health, already strained from chain smoking and heavy drinking, began to falter under the weight of his anger and frustration. By 1955, the situation took another grim turn. A ban on his foreign travels confined him to Italy, turning the cities of Rome, Naples, and Sicily into a gilded cage. The once powerful Charlie Luciano was trapped in his homeland, struggling to maintain a shadow of his former empire as he watched the very men he had built amass fortunes across the Atlantic. Italy, his reluctant home, seemed to offer nothing but restrictions. Exiled in 1946, Luciano had handed control of his empire to Meyer Lansky, Willie Moretti, Longy Zwillman, Red Levine, Frank Scalise, Little Augie Pisano, Albert Anastasia, and Frank Costello. But the burden of leadership had its price. Moretti would be murdered in 1951. Joe Adonis would be deported. Costello would retire in 1957. The same year, Anastasia and Scalise would be murdered. Little Augie Pisano and Longy Zwillman would be murdered in 1959. This decline in Luciano's power started with one man, and his name was Frank Costello. Costello's rise and fall thrust organized crime into the blinding public gaze, with Luciano witnessing the impact from afar. In 1949, Time magazine's feature spotlighted Costello and his peers, including Al Capone and Dion O'Banion. The Kefauver hearings in 1951 heightened this scrutiny, beaming organized crime into American homes through the novelty of television. The mob, once hidden in shadow, became front-page news and primetime entertainment. While Luciano was trapped in a gilded cage, watching the transformation of his world through a television screen, his empire's inner workings were now revealed to millions. Technology had brought an unexpected new era, and with it, a new kind of celebrity. In Britain, television introduced the monarchy in grandeur, broadcasting the Queen's coronation. But in America, the Kefauver hearings paraded mobsters like Albert Anastasia, Longy Zwillman, and Costello himself. In a peculiar juxtaposition, organized crime now competed with royalty for public fascination. Faces once known only in back rooms now graced the screens of American living rooms, a national drama unfolding nightly. Luciano watched the hearings unfold with growing dread. The spotlight was searing, and the tide of exposure felt inevitable. The famed mobsters of his inner circle Men like Meyer Lansky, Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Frank Scalise, Tony Accardo, Paul Ricca, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Santo Trafficante Jr., and Carlos Marcello were now household names. Even political allies, like Mayor William O'Dwyer and Governor Thomas Dewey, came under intense scrutiny. Dewey, who had once prosecuted Luciano and now dismissed public inquiries into the mob's influence, inadvertently became part of the unfolding drama, accused of allowing corruption to flourish. The Kefauver Committee's probing questions struck at the heart of the underworld's power structure, forcing men like Frank Costello to appear before the camera, their hands fidgeting rather than showing their faces. For Luciano, the hearings were a nightmare, a slow, unending assault, dragging his legacy into the unforgiving light of public opinion. As each revelation played out, Luciano sensed his dwindling chance of returning to the United States. The mob was publicly branded as a shadow government, wielding invisible power over society. Mobsters across the nation invoked the Fifth Amendment, refusing to answer the committee's questions, adding fuel to Kefauver's relentless fire. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover publicly denied organized crime's existence, insinuating that corruption among police, judges, and senators allowed these mobsters to operate with impunity. The lines were drawn in a clash between justice and secrecy, with the spotlight's harsh glare intensifying. Luciano watched the fallout from his darkened living room, feeling the walls of his gilded prison close in further. The Italian authorities, now emboldened by the committee's findings, interrogated him frequently. Even as he had distanced himself from crime in Italy, his name was never far from controversy. It all came to a head in 1954 when he was summoned to testify about his alleged support for the Allies during the Sicilian invasion. With shrewd defiance, Luciano performed a grand act, painting himself as a patriot, a man who'd used his influence for America's wartime success. His testimony won over the court in Palermo, turning public opinion in his favor. It was a masterstroke, creating newfound sympathy among Italy's elite and allies, who would later shield him from continued persecution. Despite his theatrics in court, Luciano knew his dream of returning to the United States was fading. Tom Dewey's defeat in the 1948 election and Eisenhower's ascension to power in 1952 cemented his fate. The door back to America had slammed shut. Any hope he might have harbored of reversing his deportation was now just a fading dream. By 1955, Luciano realized he would never leave Italian soil. His wife, Igea, had always dreaded a return to the States, fearing it would draw him back into the life he claimed to have left behind. With her encouragement, they made a home in Italy, securing an apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples. Bookshelves, wood paneling, and personal touches filled the space, and they hired a housekeeper, Lydia, to complete their settled life. Luciano even acquired 2 miniature Manchester Terriers that trailed him everywhere, small comforts in his twilight years. Despite his attempt at domesticity, Luciano's thoughts often drifted to his former life. When Joe Adonis, a longtime associate, finally surrendered his fight against American authorities, choosing voluntary departure over forced deportation, he arrived in Italy aboard the luxury liner Conte Biancamano. Adonis's lavish arrival, marked by a $3 million bankroll stashed in Swiss accounts, reignited old rivalries and tensions. Although speculation of a reunion swirled, Luciano dismissed the idea publicly, claiming he had nothing in common with Adonis. Their relationship had soured years prior, and the resentment lingered. A week later, however, they met discreetly in a small hotel, their conversation a stilted echo of past camaraderie. The years had fostered jealousy and mistrust. Adonis offered updates on American operations, and they exchanged information about shifting power dynamics. The conversation lacked the warmth of friendship, replaced by a detached business rapport. The year-end brought unexpected relief for Luciano. Some travel restrictions were lifted, marking a minor reprieve in his exile. As 1956 loomed, deportees across Italy petitioned the United States, pleading to return to the country they'd once called home. Even Luciano filed a formal appeal, though his hopes were dim. Eisenhower's administration had no interest in revisiting the past. "I never expected it," Luciano later remarked. "So when it didn't happen, it didn't disappoint me. Aslinger and Siragusa kept feeding Washington lies about me. When they denied my appeal, Igea was actually happy. She feared America would only pull me back into the rackets." But his wife's happiness couldn't soften the sting. He was a man bound by fate, his ambition chafing against the limitations of exile. A visit from Carlo Gambino in 1950 had sparked discussions about a transition, and Luciano hinted he wanted out of life, a sentiment that only grew stronger. As his influence in America waned, the next generation, Vito Genovese, Carlos Marcello, Sam Giancana, Mike Miranda, Tommy Eboli, Tommy Lucchese, and Santo Trafficante, rose, seizing power in an era shaped by new alliances and a ruthless ambition. The mantle of Luciano's empire passed to those he once called friends. Meyer Lansky managed the complexities in Cuba, while Frank Costello, worn down by relentless scrutiny, considered retirement. In his final years, Luciano embraced a quieter life, opening a small medical equipment store in Naples, selling X-ray machines and fluoroscopes. Yet the spectre of his past lingered, bringing visitors from the States, old allies like Red Levine, still bound by loyalty and secrecy. He found solace in a Sicilian villa owned by Rosario Chinky Vitality, a retreat where he could escape Italy's ceaseless surveillance. Despite occasional glimpses of freedom, his life remained cloaked in watchful eyes, haunted by memories of a once vast empire now left to others. When Adonis made one last appearance around Christmas, the reunion underscored the finality of Luciano's reality. He was a relic of an era slipping away, his legacy carried on by men who had once been his subordinates. Italy, once a place of reluctant exile, had become his world, and the life he once knew in America receded into myth. For the man who had once ruled from the shadows, there was no glorious return, only the quiet, bittersweet end of a legacy. The festive lights danced along the city streets, casting a glow over Christmas celebrations. But for Charlie Luciano and his wife, Milan held no holiday cheer. Their trip wasn't a mere family visit. It was a journey born of urgency, wrapped in shadows of looming troubles from New York. Whispers had reached Luciano's ears, carrying the weight of unsettled alliances and unanswered threats. Behind the cheer of the season, a storm gathered strength, one that would draw Luciano and Joe Adonis into its spiraling heart. The clashing world of organized crime held no mercy as powerful men vied for control. Discord with Vito Genovese lingered in the air like a bitter taste, but behind it loomed a more cunning figure, Carlo Gambino. A seismic shift was upon them, a new era with young ambitious powerhouses like Gambino, Genovese, Joe Colombo, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Bonanno, Russell Bufalino, Tony Accardo, with Santo Trafficante Jr. reigning over Florida, and Carlos Marcello in Louisiana. The turn of the decade heralded their collective rise, casting the shadows of the old guard further into the past. As Luciano sat under the heavy thumb of his enforced curfew, his wife's watchful eye never leaving him, he found his escape in the pages of Shakespeare, the words a balm to his restless mind. One night he reached for Julius Caesar. There, in the lines of betrayal and ambition, he found a reflection of his own life's brutal theatre. "Well," he muttered with a knowing sigh, "in Julius Caesar, you remember a guy by the name of Cassius. He was a pain in the arse. It seemed like everybody got Cassius in his life. I got one too. Only his name is Vito Genovese." By the end of the 1960s, as the twilight of his years cast a long shadow, Charlie knew all too well that betrayal could come from unexpected places. Lansky, the friend he had trusted implicitly, now stood accused of the ultimate sin: betrayal. That bond, once solid as steel, lay in tatters. Luciano's voice, tinged with a lifetime's wisdom and a touch of bitterness, carried his accusation. Come to think of it, I even have two Cassius in my life, the other being a guy by the name of Meyer Lansky. But I did not get on to him for a long time. Back in 1956, Luciano had found himself face to face with an old adversary, Joe Adonis, in the chill of the Christmas season. Though their dislike was mutual, the gravity of the news from New York had bound them together for this uneasy meeting. Vito Genovese, relentless and calculating, had laid plans to seize power in the family. With Adonis deported, Costello on the edge of retirement, and Lansky maneuvering through the tides of Cuba, Genovese had seized his moment. He made his bid for the throne. But while Vito painted himself as the rightful heir, Luciano, Gambino, Adonis, Costello, and even Lansky held silent contempt for his ambitions. They would never recognize him as the boss. Costello, trapped in the web of legal battles and now facing jail time for contempt charges, became Luciano's sole remaining hope. And Luciano, seeing his life's empire slipping into dangerous hands, turned toward Lansky, believing him to be his last true ally. I figured my last good friend Meyer Lansky was still around, and that he would be looking after things for me and keeping a leash on that greedy pig, Luciano grumbled, a hardened edge in his voice as his suspicions took shape. I knew Vito was burning with ambition to be the boss of bosses, and that someday he'd make a try for it. From what Joe Adonis told me, I could see Vito had already been at work. Adonis revealed how Genovese had already begun the maneuvering, replacing loyal men with those willing to bow to his authority, promoting ambitious soldiers like Tommy Eboli and Tony Bender. Luciano could almost see it unfolding before him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Adonis was hiding something. Outside of Joe telling me trouble was brewing, all I got from him was double talk, he recalled with a hint of disdain. He knew how I felt about him ever since that time at Zurich airport. But I thought when it came to stuff in the States, we were still partners. But he just would not mention Vito's name, and I had the impression he was siding with him. If that was so, it had to be against me. Eventually, the message from New York came through a courier Luciano barely trusted. Tommy Eboli, a former fight manager with a notorious temper. Eboli was a man Luciano found hard to read, a figure tainted by past violence and a deep-seated hunger for control, now tangled in the narcotics trade that eroded trust within the ranks. But still, Eboli was the one sent to deliver the news. I guess he'd been told by Vito to watch his mouth with me, Luciano mused, still unsure of the man's loyalties. Eboli said they'd had a meeting of the council to discuss Frank Costello. Frank had told Vito and the rest a few months before that he wanted out. He was in so much hot water, he hardly had time left over for the Unione's business. Luciano's voice grew soft, almost reverent, when he spoke of Frank. Hell, Frank had been part of this since the beginning. He helped me set the thing up, and he'd been with me all the way. So I didn't see any reason an exception couldn't be made in this case. But the council's vote was unanimous. Every man had agreed, even Adonis, though he had failed to send word to Luciano himself. Suspicion thickened in Luciano's mind. I asked Tommy whether Adonis had voted before me, and he said yes. He went along with everybody. Luciano's eyes narrowed with doubt, his instincts tingling. I began to wonder why Adonis didn't send word to me when he was asked for his vote before Eboli showed up in Naples. I couldn't think of no answer, except my nose tells me something stinks. The trust that once anchored Luciano's world was slipping, unraveling thread by thread, beneath a shadow of treachery. Decades of alliances, seemingly carved in stone, now crumbled in the face of betrayal. Most shocking of all, from the man who had stood beside him for over 40 years. Forced to navigate this treacherous maze of underworld politics, Luciano braced himself for a storm of deception and power plays. Through Tommy Eboli, he communicated his acceptance of Costello's retirement, adding a playful jab to mask the gravity of his message. "Tell Frank he can pick any house he's got. The one on Sands Point, or any other hideaway of his choosing," he quipped. But beneath the jest, Luciano's mind whirred. With caution layered under humor, he sent a private note to Costello via the reliable APO address, hinting at the unseen perils waiting in the criminal shadows. Unable to entrust anyone with his words, Luciano turned to an unlikely ally, Uncle Sam, certain that the postal service would keep his secrets. In this delicate game, he banked on the safety of the mail, penning a request for Costello to lay everything out and send word through a trusted messenger. A month later, the answer arrived by way of Pat Eboli, known to some as Pat Ryan, the younger brother of Tommy. The two Ebolis couldn't have been more different in Luciano's eyes. While Tommy stirred distrust, Pat inspired loyalty. Pat was a dependable soldier in Luciano's empire, the kind of man who could carry both Luciano's trust and a suitcase full of cash across the Atlantic without a second thought. Costello, too, recognized Pat's loyalty. At a quiet meeting in Astoria, Costello slipped him the answer Luciano sought, an answer that echoed across the ocean to the very heart of Italy. With a slow, contemplative nod, Luciano read Costello's warning. "First, Joe was right," the letter began. "Trouble is brewing." Costello's message confirmed Adonis's ominous predictions. Vito Genovese was quietly gathering power, setting the stage for a showdown. Joe Bananas had confided to Costello just weeks before that Vito had been meeting with the heads of other families, feeling out where their loyalties would lie if the time for battle came. But Vito, Costello wrote, didn't have the sense to read a man's intentions. He thought he could muscle his way into everyone's loyalty, Costello's message hinted. That's Vito's weakness. He always reads people wrong. Bananas, smart enough to foresee the conflict, knew that for Vito to push Luciano aside, he would have to contend with powerful allies, Anastasia, Lucchese, and others who wouldn't yield without a fight. Pat's recounting of the message continued, steady, each word layered with Costello's careful insight. When asked if he was truly ready to retire, Pat recited Costello's words with conviction. "Tell Charlie I'm going to retire, even if it kills me." A laugh escaped Luciano, knowing Costello's stubborn nature. He didn't need more words. He understood the gravity of his friend's position. The message was clear, each word a stroke of warning painted across a canvas of dangerous ambition. Costello was declaring that Vito cared little for any council decision or allegiance. He was going to grab the throne of organized crime, and he would do it without remorse, no matter how much blood had to be spilled along the way. Luciano had been careful, meticulously delaying this moment, knowing the stakes that lay hidden beneath each decision. When deportation tore him from his empire, he passed the reins to Frank Costello, trusting him to keep order. But by 1956, cracks had formed in the walls of Luciano's organization. Costello's urge to retire left Luciano vulnerable, his once ironclad influence now exposed to shifting tides and emerging threats. Joe Adonis, a trusted lieutenant, had already been deported, and with two of his inner circles gone, Luciano stood at a dangerous crossroads. Tommy Lucchese was tied up with his own family, and Albert Anastasia's attention had drifted to personal matters. For days, Luciano lingered in the shadows, delaying his return home to his wife, Igea, shielding her from the dark undercurrents surging out of New York. The daily deluge of updates chipped away at the image of control he struggled to maintain. As the once loyal Luciano family faced the inevitable shift, Vito Genovese seized his chance, tearing through Luciano's carefully built ranks. With a calculated cruelty, he removed Luciano's men, replacing them with those sworn to his own ambitions. In stark contrast, Costello was preoccupied with navigating his legal troubles, his hands full with holdings in gambling and high-stakes real estate. His empire spanned Beverly Hills and Las Vegas, with casinos managed by Meyer Lansky, Jake Lansky, and Phil Castell. The properties, worth fortunes even in those days, extended to prime locations on Wall Street and Park Avenue, their values now unimaginable. Costello wanted one thing: peace. He hoped to retire quietly, drawing income from his legitimate investments, in line with the unspoken rule. Leave behind only the underworld, not the fruits of it. Most council members gave Costello's retirement their blessing, but Vito Genovese had other plans. Although he initially voiced agreement, Vito soon turned, openly opposing Costello's exit. Luciano seethed as he learned of it. When I heard about that, I was sure Vito had started to make his move by beginning a real squeeze on Frank, he reflected, anger flickering beneath his words. He got up at the last meeting I was told about and said, "There's only one way a guy could get out. Frank would not quit and live." Then I heard that Lansky got up and said, "Frank should have the right to live in peace after all he's done for everybody." That gave Vito the opening he was looking for. Vito didn't want Costello's assets in the pot to be divided among the families, despite his claims. Luciano knew better. I realized there had to be something else. That little son of a bitch was out to get Costello, because he never forgot that time Costello insulted him back in the Claridge Hotel, he recounted, anger laced in every word. That was when Costello shut him down over bringing Dutch Schultz into our outfit. I just knew that grudge had been burning in Vito's mind all these years, like a slow fire waiting to rage. Then Bartolo Luciano brought news from New York, along with a sum of money and a message from Albert Anastasia. A meeting had taken place only 2 days before Bart's departure, and Anastasia didn't mince words. Vito finally opened it and said he was going to be the boss, Bart relayed. Albert told him he was going to be the boss of nothing. He said, "I set up everything back in 1931 so that no one guy could run anybody else's outfit." If Vito thought he was going to change the way of operating and try to become another Maranzano, Albert would personally make sure Vito would be very, very sorry. Even Lansky, ever the pragmatist, attempted to diffuse the tension. Bart continued. Lansky tried to calm everybody down by saying that Costello might end up in a stir for a long stretch, and that could solve a lot of problems. He asked Vito, after all, how much of a danger could Frank be if he's in jail? Vito, sensing the sway Lansky held, backpedaled, conceding. "Okay," Vito said. "Maybe you're right. Maybe we ought to just let him take the rap. Just let him fight his own fight, and not help him out at all." Luciano could hardly believe the words. The betrayal, cutting, deep. Genovese's lust for power had blinded him to their code, the law that bound them together. "What Genovese was doing was going against everything we always did," Luciano murmured bitterly. "When a guy got into trouble, everybody helped him out. And if he went away for good, we would help his family. Now that dirty prick was telling the council we ought to forget the rules any time they got in his way to the top." He shook his head, feeling the weight of his brother's words. "I didn't want to involve Bart in this," he said quietly, regret filling his voice. But the betrayal and the brutal ambition of Vito Genovese had drawn in everyone, even family. As Luciano stood on the edge of the unraveling empire he had built, he knew the path forward was dark, and the men he once called allies were turning into rivals. Lansky stood on the brink of power in a league all his own. With his grip on Miami's gambling world, he expanded his empire, weaving operations from Detroit, where he worked closely with Joe Zerilli's son, to New Orleans, where he and Phil Castile joined forces on the Louisiana casino circuit. Lansky had even managed to curry favor with the most ruthless crime bosses of the South, like Carlos Marcello and Silver Dollar Sam. Yet, despite his inroads, Carlos Marcello remained wary, harboring a deep mistrust of Jewish gangsters, a sentiment that Lansky navigated with skill, but without illusions. In Las Vegas, Lansky operated alongside the Chicago outfit, Mo Dalitz, the New York Mafia, and every other family that was in Vegas, including the Maceo crime family, stretching operations across California with allies from the California crime families and Mickey Cohen, the face of their West Coast dealings. Lansky's network stretched from coast to coast, from Michigan and Ohio to Pennsylvania, New York, Louisiana, Mississippi, Florida, and beyond. The Chicago outfit reigned over Illinois, while Lansky's partnerships reached through Havana with the Corsican and Cuban mafias, blending effortlessly with Frank Costello's people, Russell Bufalino, and Stefano Magaddino's influence. Bufalino, alongside John Martino, was entrusted with the flow of cash in and out of Havana, while operations extended into the Bahamas and beyond. Lansky's reach didn't stop at America's borders. In Brazil, his people managed hotels, resorts, and casino ventures. Through extensive money laundering channels, he drove unprecedented amounts into legitimate U.S. investments, fueling hotel construction, casino developments, and ambitious political careers. He controlled lobbyist firms defending civil rights leagues, a calculated move that extended his influence. As Lansky cemented his empire, he had become a man heavily shielded by crime families and legitimate fronts, a formidable force who wielded power without needing to pull a trigger. His connections and intellect set him apart. He didn't need muscle to prove his worth. His brilliance was enough. Yet behind closed doors, Italian bosses eyed each other with suspicion, as they had for generations. The fight for the elusive title of Boss of Bosses simmered in shadows and backrooms, a war fought across multiple fronts. Lansky knew that the landscape was changing, and he needed to keep control, particularly with volatile figures like Albert Anastasia, whose impulsiveness made his hold at the top tenuous. Costello, once an unwavering leader, was now too old to fend off the rising tide of younger, hungrier players like Tommy Eberly, Vito Genovese, and Mike Miranda, whose ambitions threatened to disrupt the old order. Lansky understood that transition was inevitable, and he quietly strategized ways to make it as smooth as possible. He could only offer advice and control what he could while watching the pieces shift across the board. As Luciano's eyes turned toward him, suspicion creeping in, Lansky knew that his loyalty would soon be put to the test. Lansky's edge came not from brute force, but from his vast network, his portfolio, his influence, and his unparalleled acumen. He was insulated by an intricate web of associations far older and more sprawling than Luciano's. Ties to the Louisiana syndicates, alliances with Bufalino, and reliable confidants like Jimmy Blue Eyes made Lansky an irreplaceable linchpin in the underworld. He didn't just survive, he thrived in an empire built on intellect, alliances, and influence, a network so intertwined that Lansky himself had become untouchable. Meyer Lansky was troubled. Some mornings, before Havana awoke and the sun crept over the Malecon, he'd tell his driver to pull over near the massive stone monument commemorating the sinking of the USS Maine. That event, the Maine sinking in 1898, had pulled the United States into a war with Spain, a war that ultimately left Cuba under American sway. Lansky wasn't battling the Spanish, but he was an American outsider in a land that wasn't his own. In those quiet dawn moments, facing the ocean with waves crashing against the sea wall, he could feel his isolation, pondering the uncertain future of his empire amid a shifting world. His driver, Armando Jaime Casieles, waited patiently in the car. Jaime was no stranger to dangerous worlds. Recently enlisted by the Havana mob's boss, Jaime had made his way to Lansky's side from the bustling casino floors of Las Vegas, where he'd been a croupier at the Flamingo. Their first encounter had been in Vegas when Lansky, on a business visit, spotted Jaime, a Cuban with a streetwise past and a quick mind. The mob boss had looked him over and said, "You look like someone who can handle himself. Why don't you come to work for me?" Jaime, who had fled Havana after a scuffle in the slums of Jesus Maria left a man dead, recognized the opportunity. He had smuggled himself out of Cuba in the trunk of a car on a ferry bound for Key West. After a stint in Chicago's suburbs, where he studied at Northwestern, he found his way to the neon lights of Las Vegas, working his way up to the casino floor. But when Lansky, the mythical figure of Las Vegas, especially at the Flamingo, offered him a job, it was an invitation he couldn't refuse. When they finally spoke at a casino event, Lansky laid out his vision. "I'm an old friend of Fulgencio Batista. He's good to me in Havana. I don't really need a bodyguard. When I do, Batista sends one my way. But I need someone I can rely on, a driver, a valet, someone to keep me in good company." Jaime, sizing up the mob boss, who looked shorter and plainer than he'd imagined, admired Lansky's calm authority. Lansky had this way of looking directly at you, piercing as if seeing right through to your history, your secrets. Jaime was sure Lansky knew, or at least suspected, the truth about the incident in Havana. Jaime accepted the offer. When he arrived in Cuba in February 1957, Lansky was staying at the prestigious Hotel Nacional. Jaime's suite was right next to Lansky's. On his first day, Lansky, already making himself comfortable, began undressing right there in front of him. "Let's celebrate," he said, tossing his shirt aside. "Go down and get a bottle of Pernod." "Pernod? What's that?" Jaime asked. "It's something special. You've never had it." Lansky raised an eyebrow. Jaime fetched the bottle, returned to the room, and found Lansky lounging in his underwear. "Go ahead, pour one for yourself." "You'll see how good it is," Lansky encouraged. Jaime, glancing at Lansky's casual manner, wondered if there was more to this invitation. Was Lansky hinting at something unusual? The evening wore on, and as they sipped their Pernod and chatted about the world, Jaime's suspicions began to feel absurd. Years later he'd laugh about it, remembering how he'd read too much into that first encounter. "We just talked," he recalled. Then he went off, showered and dressed. That was all. But him walking around in his underwear like that, it stuck with me. Jaime became Lansky's trusted driver, handling everything from a Chevrolet Impala to a slick black Mercedes reserved for special occasions, shadowing the mob boss across Havana and wherever Lansky's Cuban empire called. Under the blazing Cuban sun, Jaime found himself behind the wheel, chauffeuring none other than the Havana mob's infamous kingpin, Meyer Lansky. The job sounded like any driver's dream. Short jaunts through Havana, stops at the skeleton of the Grand Hotel Riviera, rising along the Malecon, and long, languid afternoons under the Havana sky. At first, Lansky seemed like the epitome of a gentleman. He rarely raised his voice, keeping an almost eerie calm that softened only when he'd worn, "Despacio, Jaime, despacio," his clumsy Spanish a gentle reprimand to slow down. But as days turned to weeks, Jaime started to notice cracks in that steely calm. Lansky, who used to savor every meal at his favorite haunt, La Zaragozana, barely touched his food. In the quiet of his hotel suite, he'd sometimes nurse half a bottle of wine or a strong Pernod, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond Havana's neon-lit nights. Jaime's suspicion simmered. Something had Lansky on edge, and it was more than the threat of Castro's rebels stirring in the provinces, despite Batista's relentless assurances that the revolution was a smoldering ember. Havana was a city on a tightrope, the mood shifting as whispers of Castro's survival floated in from Oriente province. Bombings and sabotage peppered the city in early 1957, a grim retort to Batista's iron-fisted clampdown on dissent. The tension pulsed in the streets, but Jaime soon learned that Lansky's unease ran deeper than Havana's political turmoil. This wasn't about the revolution, he realized. Lansky was staring down the Atlantic, worried about trouble with his mob connections back in the United States. Jaime's duties soon extended beyond routine drives. Once a week, he'd take Lansky to meet the mob's upper echelon, a sinister cabal tucked away in the lush, concealed estate of Joe Hoboken Joe Stassi, a gravel-voiced bruiser from New Jersey. Born on Manhattan's Lower East Side in 1906, Stassi had known Lansky since Prohibition's heyday, when he'd worked for the notorious bootlegger Longies Willman. Stassi's past was studded with dark accolades, including his role in the infamous Dutch Schultz hit in 1936. Now, the wiry hitman had transitioned into a behind-the-scenes operator, channeling the wisdom of his mentor, Arnold Rothstein, the legendary Big Brain. Rothstein's gospel of mixing gangsters, showbiz, and crooked officials into one cauldron of power was something Stassi and Lansky were now fervently applying to the hotbed of Havana. Joseph Hoboken Joe Stassi was more than just a familiar face in the Havana underworld. He was a vital cog in the organized crime machine, reporting directly to mafia titans like Charlie Luciano, the Buffalo Mob, Vito Genovese, and Jerry Catena. Stassi's influence spanned decades, first as a trusted figure in Luciano's heyday, and later as a valuable player for Genovese. His connections ran deep, not only with men like Russell Bufalino, to whom he provided constant updates on Havana's mob dealings, but also with crime circles beyond American shores. Stassi was deeply enmeshed in the narcotics trade, building alliances with the Corsican and Cuban mafias. He even maintained ties with Carlos Marcello, the powerful New Orleans kingpin. In the heart of Havana, the historic Hotel Plaza served as one of Stassi's headquarters. Originally established by Captain Walter Fletcher Smith, the hotel had evolved from an elegant colonial structure into a luxurious landmark. Designed by Ricardo Galbis Abella and constructed by New York engineers Purdy and Henderson, the plaza first opened its doors in 1906 and held its grand inauguration in 1909. The building underwent a significant facelift in 1919, adding a glamorous rooftop garden complete with a ballroom and restaurant, making it a magnet for high society and notable guests, including luminaries like Albert Einstein, Babe Ruth, Isadora Duncan, and Anna Pavlova. The 1950s saw the hotel step into darker territory with the opening of its casino, a joint venture between Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno Stassi and his son, Joe Stassi Jr. An associate of Lansky, Stassi leveraged the casino to cement his standing in Havana's illicit scene. Yet as Fidel Castro's revolution gained momentum, the hotel's fate took a grim turn. In early January 1959, Castro's rebel forces overtook Havana, and mobs destroyed the casino, marking the end of Stassi's Havana venture amid the crumbling of Batista's regime. Stassi's mansion, nestled in the tangled greenery near the Almendares River, was a fortress of mob intrigue. A curved driveway led up to a gated entrance, with walls veiled by lush tropical plants. It was there, on Thursday or Friday afternoons, that the mob's most ambitious minds gathered. Lansky, occasionally flanked by his brother Jake, would sit among Havana's hand-picked players in the library or spill out onto the sun-drenched veranda. The ensemble cast included Trafficante, the Cellini brothers, Norman Rothman, and casino legend Wilbur Clark, along with a tier of mob operatives whose reputations stretched from Florida to New Jersey. There was Thomas Blackjack McGinty, a burly ex-labor enforcer from Cleveland whose past was peppered with barroom brawls and underworld deals. Having staked his claim in cities like Youngstown, Covington, and even the glitzy Vegas Strip, McGinty now held a piece of Havana's glamorous casino scene at the famed Hotel Nacional. Alongside him was Charles the Blade Tureen, better known as Charles White, a smooth-talking nightclub owner turned Miami heavyweight, now primed to manage the Capri Hotel's nightclub in the posh Vedado neighborhood. Then came Nicholas, the Fat Butcher, Di Costanzo, a hulking figure known for his explosive temper and connections that spanned from New Jersey to Miami. Di Costanzo, whose towering frame struck fear into rivals, was Capri's casino floor manager, a role that seemed to magnify his notorious temper. Armando Jaime never attended the mob's clandestine gatherings. His role was simple: be ready when Lansky needed him, often lingering outside in the car or running errands until summoned. Occasionally, though, one of Lansky's associates would slide into the back seat, turning the car into an impromptu meeting room where murmurs about the Havana mob's future filled the air. Jaime, from his position at the wheel, couldn't ignore the name that kept resurfacing: Anastasia. The very mention of it was enough to cast a shadow, even on a sunlit Havana street. Jaime knew the name Albert Anastasia, remembered from his college days at Northwestern University, when the Kefauver hearings held America captive in front of their televisions. Anastasia had been unmasked as the ruthless head of a lethal Brooklyn mob faction called Murder, Inc. In that pantheon of the nation's darkest villains, he stood out as a brutal enforcer, a spectre who'd sent shivers down the spine of anyone who dared cross him. From the snatches of conversation Jaime overheard, it was clear that Anastasia had become a thorn in the side of Havana's mob. Though he didn't grasp every detail, he gathered that the trouble centered on Anastasia's dissatisfaction with the way Havana's riches were being parceled out. He felt cheated, shut out of a cut he believed was rightfully his, and was letting his anger be known. The most anxious of all was Lansky. Their history stretched back to the early days of organized crime, when Lansky and Anastasia were ambitious upstarts navigating the underworld's deadly waters. Few could unsettle Lansky like Anastasia. He was unpredictable, with a well-earned reputation as a killer without conscience, a mob legend who'd attended every major summit from New York to Havana. Even Lansky, with his sharp intellect and diplomatic savvy, knew Anastasia was the one man who could throw the entire Havana operation into chaos. Known as the Mad Hatter for his unhinged temper, Anastasia could bulldoze any mob operation without a second thought. So far, Lansky's reign over Havana had gone smoothly. Since Batista handed him the keys to Cuba's gaming empire, Lansky had spread the wealth wisely, ensuring a slice of the action for the mob's most powerful players. From New York to Chicago, Miami to Las Vegas, every major mob outfit had a vested interest in Havana, thanks to Lansky's diplomatic touch. He'd built this empire on a delicate balance of power, and it had worked, until Anastasia demanded his due. Anastasia was a hulking figure at 5 feet 8 inches and 210 pounds, with the cold, unyielding face of an undertaker. Photographs of him were rare and grim. If the flash captured anything, it was his dark eyes sunken beneath a furrowed brow, as if carrying a lifetime's worth of grudges. Violence was as natural to him as breathing. This was a man who didn't settle scores with words. One investigator from the Kefauver hearings described him bluntly. Albert Anastasia has a lot of skeletons in his closet. To his core, Anastasia was fiercely loyal to Charlie Luciano, the man who'd given him his start in the mob. Back in 1931, he'd reportedly helped Luciano eliminate Joe the Boss Masseria, setting the stage for the birth of the Commission, a new, unified mob era in the United States. That earned him a substantial reward, control over a vast empire on Brooklyn's docks, where he and his brother Anthony, known as Tough Tony, held sway over a goldmine of underworld revenue, especially through the war years when their stranglehold on the waterfront only grew tighter. By the early 50s, Lansky fancied himself past the era of men like Albert Anastasia. In a world where Lansky was controlled, calculating, and refined, Anastasia was his opposite, reckless, fiery, a walking powder keg whose brutal brand of violence cared nothing for subtlety. Albert's audacity had no limits, and it showed. When he took out the Mangano brothers, it was under the mob's code of business: eliminate rivals, secure power. But his hit on Arnold Schuster, that was something else entirely. It was a quiet night in 1952, and Anastasia was sprawled in his New Jersey mansion, watching television. The screen flickered with an interview featuring Schuster, an unassuming citizen with zero ties to crime, who had just helped the police bring down notorious bank robber Willie Sutton. Schuster, proudly clutching a Good Citizen award, enraged Anastasia. Without knowing Sutton or having any personal stake, Anastasia erupted, "I can't stand squealers, I want him dead." He swiftly put together a hit squad, and on March 8th, Schuster was gunned down on a Brooklyn street near his home. The city erupted in outrage. The press hounded Anastasia's every move, and the public was horrified at the murder of an innocent man. But Anastasia's response to the heat? Cold and simple. When the weapon traced back to hitman Freddie Tenuto, Anastasia made Tenuto disappear, permanently. His body vanished, his fate sealed, as just another skeleton in Anastasia's ever-growing closet. Killing, for Anastasia, wasn't just business. It was instinct. Years later, Mafia turncoat Joseph Valachi would recall, with Anastasia, it was always, killed, kill, kill. If someone told him something bad about a guy, he'd snap, hit him. Hit him. While Lansky was meticulously building a gambling empire in Cuba, Anastasia was sequestered in his fortified New Jersey estate, drawing up hit lists. Then came November 1955, and with it, the IRS, dragging Anastasia to trial for tax evasion. The first trial, a grueling 5-week spectacle, ended in a hung jury, but a retrial was on the calendar for 1956. This time, the IRS had a promising witness, Charles Ferry, a contractor from Fort Lee who'd earned nearly $9,000 for work on Anastasia's mansion. But Ferry and his wife soon disappeared from their Miami home. The FBI report described a horror scene. Blood smeared across floors, a crimson pool beside Mrs. Ferry's bed, but no bodies. Ferry and his wife had simply vanished. The slaughter continued. Not long after, Vincent Macri, a known Anastasia associate, turned up riddled with bullets and crammed into a Bronx car trunk. A few days later, his brother Benedicto went missing, supposedly dumped in the murky waters of the Passaic River. With 2 Ferris and 2 Macris out of the picture, any credible testimony against Anastasia evaporated. Anastasia sidestepped a prison sentence, taking a light plea on 2 tax charges and serving less than a year in federal lockup in Michigan. Yet the legal saga had drained his coffers, and once free, he was desperate for fresh income. All eyes turned to Havana. Luciano had long envisioned Havana as an extension of mob territory, a tantalizing empire outside U.S. jurisdiction. Now banished to Italy, he had become bitter, watching his Cuban dreams unfold from the sidelines. According to the FBI, Anastasia visited Luciano in Italy in May 1957, joined by another exiled mobster, Joe Adonis. Their conversation? Cuba. Luciano, sidelined by his old partners, urged Anastasia to demand his rightful share of the Cuban profits, igniting Albert's simmering resentment. Anastasia returned to America with a fire stoked, ready to claim his cut. Not long after his clandestine rendezvous in Italy, Albert Anastasia summoned the heads of the Havana mob for a face-to-face in New York City. The chosen venue was the Warwick Hotel, an iconic relic from the Prohibition era, standing tall on West 55th Street. Room 1009 was quietly booked by Anthony Capi Coppola, Anastasia's loyal chauffeur and bodyguard, setting the stage for a gathering that would ripple across Havana's underworld. According to a later report in the New York Telegram and Sun, the room was filled with a half-dozen American and Cuban heavies, each one watching as Anastasia's frustration spilled over. "Everybody's getting rich down there in Havana, except me," he spat. When someone mentioned his stake in the lucrative Oriental Park racetrack, he fired back, "Yeah, but what about the casinos? That's where the money is, and you know it." Lansky and his associates had seen this coming and had already worked out a solution during their regular gatherings at Joe Stassi's Havana estate. Lansky leaned forward, laying out their peace offering. "The Hilton is yours," he told Anastasia. It was a significant concession, designed to ease the volatile mobsters' anger and keep peace in their ranks. The Havana Hilton was nearing completion, after nearly 2 years of construction. A towering 660-room behemoth, set to be the largest hotel and casino on the island. The decision to hand over a substantial share of its profits to Anastasia wasn't easy. It meant cuts to everyone's take. But if this offer could sidestep a war with the Mad Hatter, it was worth the cost. Anastasia, never one to hold back his opinion, looked pleased. He said he'd come down to Havana soon, mentioning he hadn't set foot on Cuban soil since the landmark 1946 mob summit at the Hotel Nacional. "The offer sounds good," he said. "I'll be down there in the next few months to check it out myself." Lansky walked out of Warwick that day, believing he'd defused a ticking time bomb, skillfully turning another mob confrontation into a cordial agreement without spilling a drop of blood. Anastasia had been appeased, the feud smoothed over, and Lansky's empire remained intact. But as he settled back into the rhythm of his Havana empire, Lansky's relief would be short-lived. Events in Cuba were spiraling out of control, and his powerful patron, El Presidente Batista, was on the brink of losing his grip. The Havana mob's world was about to be upended in ways Lansky hadn't anticipated. As Castro's forces continued to spark unrest in Cuba, trouble was brewing in the world of organized crime. Meyer Lansky, ever the strategist, had warned Vito Genovese about a shifting power structure that could turn lethal, but Genovese brushed off Lansky's advice. Genovese now had his sights set on one goal: to claim the throne of the Luciano family for himself. To do so, he needed to eliminate one key figure: Frank Costello. If Costello were out of the way, Genovese could seize power without resistance. But a few other obstacles would also need clearing, particularly Albert Anastasia. Anastasia had inserted himself into the Havana scene, muscling in on various territories and antagonizing other mobsters. His grip on the Mangano crime family had already put him at odds with others in New York's criminal circles. Carlo Gambino, however, was emerging as a formidable force, with alliances across America that included powerful figures like Sam Giancana, Russell Bufalino, Stefano Magaddino, Joe Zerilli, Carlos Marcello, Tommy Lucchese, and long-standing connections with Santo Trafficante. Gambino's alliance with Trafficante, who reigned over Florida and Havana, positioned him as a quiet mastermind. Knowing Anastasia's volatile nature, Gambino subtly encouraged him to step on Trafficante's toes, provoking tensions that would draw the ire of the Southern Mafia. Anastasia was digging his own grave, and Gambino was more than willing to help him along. Santo Trafficante was more than just a cunning operator with a grip on Tampa and Havana. He had an ace up his sleeve, a figure as dependable as Gambino's own underworld allies, Russell Bufalino. Bufalino wasn't just any name whispered in dark corners. He was a silent powerhouse, deeply entwined with Stefano Magaddino, another heavyweight of the old-school syndicate order. Together, these titans of organized crime were veterans of shadowy alliances, stretching back to the 1940s, when they worked with Albert Anastasia in Pennsylvania to bring dock workers under the Mafia's thumb. Through unions, business ties, and blood-soaked loyalty, Bufalino and Mangano had built a criminal empire that was more than a network. It was a fortress. Mangano's alignment with Gambino during this seismic shift in the mob's hierarchy signaled a powerful endorsement. It meant the Buffalo Mafia, with all its historical muscle, was now backing Gambino's ambitions. But when Gambino set his sights on eliminating Anastasia, he wasn't just taking out a rival, he was dismantling a legacy. The problem? Anastasia's men weren't going to sit idle while their boss was erased from history. Gambino had to tread carefully, working overtime to pacify Anastasia's soldiers and ensure the family didn't spiral into an all-out civil war. And this is where Bufalino's cunning proved invaluable. For a brief and precarious moment, Russell Bufalino stepped in as a sort of caretaker, holding the shattered pieces of the Anastasia family together. His connections ran deep, particularly with Anastasia's old allies from the 1940s, and he used that influence to maintain order. It was a temporary fix, but it was enough to buy time. While Bufalino played his role, Gambino and Vito Genovese orchestrated the final moves to solidify Gambino's rise. Genovese, ever the strategist, intended to crown Gambino formally as boss, but the plan was meant to be discreet, a quiet ceremony cloaked in the Mafia's ironclad secrecy. Then came the disaster of Appalachian in 1957. What should have been an invisible shift of power erupted onto the front pages. The authorities, tipped off and armed with a rare glimpse into the underworld, raided the infamous mob summit, blowing the lid off everything. Suddenly the dots began to connect. The attempted murder of Frank Costello, the brutal slaying of Vincent Mangano, and the calculated elimination of Albert Anastasia, all of it clicked into place like a bloody puzzle. It was a chaotic moment for the Mafia. The public scrutiny brought on by Appalachian threatened to topple their carefully constructed world, and it fell to Vito Genovese to take the next decisive steps. What came next would determine whether the Mafia survived the storm, or if it would crumble under the weight of its own ambitions. Meanwhile, Genovese was focused on Costello, viewing him as a relic of an era that needed to be erased. Though Costello wanted a quiet retirement, Genovese saw him as the last tie to the old order. In the shadows, he orchestrated a hit, assigning the task to his rising confidant Tony Bender. Bender, though influential, hesitated to take on the job himself, and instead handed the assignment down to an eager young enforcer named Vincent the Chin Gigante. Gigante was a boxer and a minor hood when Genovese took him under his wing, molding him into a loyal protege. Though inexperienced, Gigante's loyalty to Genovese was unwavering. When the order came down to eliminate Costello, he was ready, despite an infamous mistake that would cement his name in mob lore. On the night of May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello was enjoying his usual rounds with close associates like Frank Erickson and Little Augie Carfano at the Peacock Lounge. The Kefauver hearings had cast a long shadow over their operations, and legal troubles loomed on the horizon. But Costello was still carrying on as usual, a picture of unflinching defiance. Around 11 that evening, he hailed a cab to his apartment at 115 Central Park West. Unbeknownst to him, Gigante was trailing, slipping into the building before Costello could even step through the door. Hidden behind a pillar, Gigante waited for the perfect moment. As Costello entered the lobby, Gigante stepped out, muttering, "This is for you, Frank," before pulling the trigger. The shot rang out, but the bullet only grazed Costello's head, carving a line above his ear. Dazed and bleeding, Costello stumbled but managed to reach the hospital, cash spilling from his pocket along with a crumpled note that recorded casino wins and "I owe you" slips. This small slip would later spark an investigation into Costello's Vegas connections and drag him further into the McLennan Committee's crosshairs. Despite the close call, Costello upheld omertà, refusing to identify his attacker, while the doorman could only offer a vague description. A fat man. Gigante, meanwhile, slipped out of sight, with Genovese quietly orchestrating his swift makeover. Months later, he reappeared, leaner, unrecognizable, and poised to take on a new role in the underworld. Back in Italy, Luciano received news of the botched hit. Reflecting on the incident with his lover Igea at his side, he could hardly contain his fury. "If I'd had my passport, I'd have been on the next plane to the States to straighten out that little bastard Vito," he seethed, trapped under the watchful eyes of Italian authorities. With his every move monitored and Igea keeping close, Luciano knew he was effectively marooned in Europe, helpless to confront the betrayal firsthand. The ripples of that night extended beyond Costello and Luciano, striking deep within the mob's power structure. Feeling the heat, Genovese retreated to his Atlantic City stronghold, surrounded by a small army of armed guards. He summoned his key lieutenants, pleading his case and positioning himself to secure support. But his maneuvering earned him more enemies than allies. Among them was little Augie Carfano, who defied Genovese's call and paid with his life 2 years later. Meanwhile, Brooklyn's Frank Scalise, Anastasia's underboss, shared a deep resentment for the way Costello had been betrayed and for Genovese's disloyalty to Luciano. By 1957, chaos reigned across mob circles, with Luciano marooned in Italy, his frustration mounting with each update. Newspapers splashed images of Costello recovering in the hospital, doctors tending to his injuries, while Igea tightened her hold on Luciano. The old boss seethed at his impotence, knowing he could do nothing to stop Genovese from making his play. "I was so goddamn pissed off that if I'd had my passport, I'd have flown anywhere to get back to the States and deal with that double-crossing Vito," he muttered, unable to shake the fury of watching his legacy crumble from afar. The stage was set for a new era, and Luciano was powerless to intervene. In the shadows of power, men like Luciano, Costello, Anastasia, Meyer Lansky, Tommy Lucchese, Mo Dalitz, Paul Ricca, Silver Dollar Sam, Trafficante Sr., Tony Bender, Russell Bufalino, Stefano Magaddino, Joe Zerilli, and Genovese orchestrated an empire that stretched far beyond the gritty streets of New York. Their network of influence reached into the White House, swayed the press, and shaped entire industries, all with moves concealed under layers of subterfuge. Yet as they wove their clandestine empire, cracks were beginning to show. J. Edgar Hoover, who had publicly denied the existence of organized crime, would soon be forced to testify before the McLennan Committee, and again in 1963, spurred by Joseph Valachi's damning revelations. The web of secrecy, once ironclad, was fraying at the edges, exposing glimpses of their vast criminal network to a watchful public. The simmering power struggle between Costello and Genovese culminated in a crucial meeting. Costello, holding all the leverage after the failed hit by Gigante, could have unleashed retribution. But in a surprising turn, he chose a different path. Eager to step away from life and pursue a quiet retirement, he struck a deal with Genovese. What choice did Frank have? A close associate later mused. He'd drop the whole thing, and Vito would let him retire with his gambling and real estate. Yet as fate would have it, Costello faced an unexpected setback, a conviction for income tax evasion that led to a short prison stint. When he emerged, he retreated to his estate in Sands Point, content to clip coupons and leave the mob world behind. The Costello shooting had sent shockwaves through the underworld, marking a seismic shift that shattered an unspoken peace dating back to the 30s. As Costello, who had been a de facto boss of bosses on Luciano's behalf, pondered the near miss, Luciano sensed that the criminal landscape beneath them was shifting, the ground buckling under the weight of ambition and betrayal. The news of Costello's shooting reached Luciano in Italy. Enraged but bound by circumstance, he wrote urgently to Meyer Lansky, advising him to send someone to assess the situation. But before Lansky could act, Tommy Eboli showed up in Naples, bearing a message straight from Genovese. "Vito says there has to be peace," Eboli urged. But the young emissary made a fatal misstep, advising Luciano to take it easy. Luciano's response was cold, tinged with irony. "Tell Vito," he replied. "The day hasn't come when he can take me in any kind of fight." Eboli, flustered, looked to Luciano for reassurance, but all he got was the door held open, along with a parting jab. "You're not like your brother. You're the one who needs to learn to take it easy." Luciano now had to tread carefully, leaning only on those bound to him by blood or old loyalties in Italy, men like Fernando Agliotti, Joe Di Giorgio, and Momo Salemi. These were men who saw Luciano as kin, who would defend him fiercely. Outsiders were not welcome. Luciano spurned any offer that came from beyond this trusted circle. As he awaited Lansky's response, Paul Gambino, brother to Carlo Gambino, arrived with news. He relayed the details of the attempt on Costello's life and the uneasy truce that followed. Paul hinted that Anastasia, now wildly unpredictable, was in serious trouble. To Luciano, it seemed Paul was advocating on Anastasia's behalf, as his brother was thought to be Anastasia's loyal right hand. So, Luciano gave his orders. Have Albert call the council, excluding Vito, and present a proposal to take Genovese out. They'd hold the meeting somewhere discreet, like Atlantic City, where they could blend in as tourists. "And tell him he's acting for me," Luciano instructed, setting his pieces in motion. The next day, Paul carried Luciano's message to Carlo Gambino, but unbeknownst to Luciano, Carlo was already orchestrating events. In reality, Gambino saw Vito Genovese as a pawn, a disposable instigator whose ambition was easily manipulated. Gambino's plan was to step in as the peacemaker, emerging as the only figure untouched by scandal. Luciano, realizing this too late, would eventually see Gambino's cunning at work, but came to respect the strategy, a familiar echo of his own moves against Maranzano and Masseria. His only animosity lay with Vito, and he expected Gambino to facilitate Genovese's downfall without opposition, fully unaware that Gambino's ambitions ran far deeper than simple mediation. "I figured Albert got my message right away," Luciano later recounted. "I expected him to call the council and get them to agree. There was no reason not to. If any boss put the rest of us in danger, he had to go. But if Albert got the message, the hot-headed bastard must have decided to ignore it, because the next thing I know he's taking matters into his own hands." By then, Albert was off his rocker, acting like some gangster from an old Cagney film. He even had that kid Arnold Schuster whacked just for being on TV, bragging about how he tipped off the cops about Willie Sutton. Anastasia's erratic actions would only accelerate his downfall, sealing his fate in a game of power moves and betrayals. And as Luciano waited, oblivious to Gambino's intricate scheme, he'd come to see the next chapter of organized crime unfold. One where Gambino, the wolf in sheep's clothing, would quietly claim the throne, leaving only whispers of his cunning in his wake. Luciano held firm to the principles he had laid down, knowing that if he were to uphold his legacy, he couldn't afford to break his own rules. "If I set the rules, I won't be the one to break them," he often reminded himself. For Vito to be removed, it had to be by order of the council, done legally, by their code. Any other way would plunge them back into chaos, and Luciano wouldn't risk it. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, Luciano harbored a hidden pain. There had been a recent attempt on his life, an incident he kept secret from his wife, shielding her from worry. But his silence came at a price, for she too was wrestling with her own private anguish. The changes in her demeanor that he had brushed off as concerns over his criminal dealings masked a much graver reality. She was battling breast cancer, a fight she hadn't shared with him. The mutual concealment weighed on their relationship, entwining personal battles with the relentless storm of organized crime. In New York, the power dynamics were shifting rapidly. Vito Genovese, poised to make his move, cast a long shadow over the delicate web Luciano had woven. With his calculating mind, Luciano understood that halting Vito's ascent would require deft strategy. In this world of shadows and silence, each player's move was critical, and the board had never been so volatile. One of Luciano's most trusted confidants, Pat Eboli, stepped into this fragile balance. Pat wasn't just an ally. To Luciano he was like family, a bond even closer than he had with his own brother, Tom. As Pat arrived in Italy, their conversation took on a deeper resonance, underscored by mutual respect. Pat updated Luciano on the complexities brewing back in New York, yet Luciano sensed his hesitation. Pat was torn, especially as his own brother Tommy was now entangled in Vito's schemes. Rather than pressuring him to betray family, Luciano simply listened. Pat confided that tensions between Vito and Anastasia were escalating, especially after Frank Scalise's recent murder. Luciano sent Pat back to New York without directives, not wanting to force him into a war that could split loyalties between blood and allegiance. But the encounter stirred a suspicion in Luciano. If Anastasia hadn't acted on his message, it could mean only one thing. Carlo Gambino hadn't relayed the instructions, suggesting Gambino's allegiance lay with Vito. Suddenly, the pieces clicked. Gambino, ever patient and calculating, was likely biding his time, allowing Vito and Anastasia to tear each other apart. Gambino would seize his moment when the dust settled, emerging as head of the Anastasia family and quietly strengthening his hold. The murder of Frank Scalise was a brutal wake-up call for Luciano, a stark reminder that in the quest for power, loyalty had little place. Scalise, known as Don Ciccio, held sway and deep respect across the mafia landscape, a man seen as the logical heir to the Anastasia throne. For Carlo Gambino, that kind of respect presented a dangerous obstacle. If Anastasia fell, Scalise would naturally ascend, uniting the family with his influence and seniority. Gambino knew he couldn't afford that. In a calculated move, Gambino leaned on Vito Genovese, a man with his own vendettas and ambitions, to eliminate Scalise. Vito took the bait, orchestrating the hit with the precision and coldness that had earned him his reputation. With Scalise out of the way, Gambino's path to power opened, removing a formidable rival and setting the stage for his own ascent. To find clarity, Luciano retreated with his wife to Taormina, Sicily, a coastal town overlooking the Ionian Sea. The tranquility of the Sicilian landscape seemed a world apart from the tumultuous streets of New York. Yet, even here, the shadow of the underworld followed. Walking the cobblestone streets with his wife, Luciano found solace, yet could not entirely escape the pull of his empire. Here, with a clear mind, he began to connect the threads of loyalty and betrayal within his organization, realizing the gravity of the game Gambino was playing. One afternoon, Luciano and Pat took a small boat off the coast. The open sea provided privacy, and Pat shared the latest news. Gambino was indeed staying on the sidelines, banking on Anastasia's volatility to serve his purpose. If Anastasia self-destructed, Gambino would be ready to assume control. Luciano knew the strategy well. He'd used it himself against Maranzano. As the boat rocked gently in the water, Luciano sent Pat back to New York without a word of instruction. He saw the family lines were already drawn, and Pat was too loyal to be dragged further into the mire. Luciano's hunch proved accurate. He predicted that once Gambino gained control, he'd reach out to Naples, extending an olive branch to seal his rise. And, sure enough, he imagined the day Gambino, or his brother Paul, would arrive to make peace. In his own cunning, Gambino had played the ultimate waiting game, positioning himself to inherit the power of the Anastasia family without lifting a finger. "Carlo's got it all figured out," Luciano would later reflect. "He'll step in after the fighting's done and claim the throne, just like I did. It's almost funny. Albert thinks he's in control, but Carlo's already the wolf at his door." Even as he saw Gambino's hand in the web of deception, Luciano found himself admiring the brilliance of it, the echoes of his own rise visible in every calculated move. And as for Vito, Luciano held one last expectation. "When this is over," he thought, "Gambino will bring Vito's head on a platter, and I'll watch him climb to the top." The game was unfolding exactly as Luciano had foreseen, yet he couldn't help but marvel at the skill of Gambino, who wore the sheep's clothing with the cunning of a wolf. The world of organized crime was at a tipping point, shifting faster than anyone could fully grasp. But Charlie Luciano, always one step ahead, had the uncanny ability to spot these changes early on. Back in the days of his grand schemes to bring down Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, Luciano wasn't just executing enemies. He was constructing the very foundations of a criminal empire that would define the future. The Atlantic City Convention of 1929 was his masterstroke, a show of power and foresight that reverberated across the underworld. The other bosses could only watch and realize that the future wasn't with their outdated, insular ways. It lay with Luciano, the man who saw a new path forward. When Masseria and Maranzano fell, Luciano was already holding cards with families across the country, setting the stage for an era where alliances replaced feuds. Yet, as the decades passed, those partnerships took on new forms. The Mafia was now a reflection of American capitalism itself, ambitious, ruthless, and all-consuming. At the same time, old-school muscle like Albert Anastasia found himself struggling to adapt. Known for his violent temper and his roots in the chaotic Prohibition era, Anastasia was a relic, embodying an approach to the game that no longer fit the modern mafia's business-like facade. His ways were a liability at a time when low profiles were critical. And while the foundation that men like Luciano built was calculated and enduring, the new wave, greedy, fast-moving, and hungry for more, were growing reckless. Power struggles and betrayals became part of the fabric of organized crime, and anyone who rocked the boat too hard was dealt with swiftly. Anastasia was edging toward that line. Meanwhile, in Cuba, the winds of revolution were gaining force. Fidel Castro, bolstered by shipments of weapons flowing in from Pennsylvania and the southern US, was gaining traction, unknowingly aided by the very criminal networks that stood to lose everything if he took over. Figures like Jack Ruby, David Ferry, John Martino, as well as contacts within the CIA connected to both Jewish mobsters and Southern crime syndicates, which were being led by Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and multiple others, were part of the complex supply chain fueling Castro's insurgency, moving arms through the jungles of Cuba. But with every step forward, they were unwittingly laying the groundwork for their own destruction, a fact that didn't go unnoticed by President Batista. The extent of Lansky's role in the Castro weapons smuggling affair remains a matter of speculation. Many believe that it was Santo Trafficante who threw his weight behind Castro, betting on a shift in power that would topple Batista, sever Lansky's influence, and bring Castro into Trafficante's own orbit. As the 1960s approached, Trafficante, eager to surpass his father's achievements and forge his own legacy, aimed to turn Cuba into his own stronghold. After inheriting the empire in 1954, Trafficante Jr. had carefully expanded his reach with a few casinos and bolstered his real estate investments. But he was always overshadowed by the rapid growth of New York's powerhouse mobsters. Cuba was his chance, a territory where he could reign unchallenged, just as in his father's early days. So, Trafficante took a chance on Castro, hoping for a cooperative ally. His decision was a gamble few others dared to take, especially as Castro's revolutionary fervor grew dangerous. When others fled Havana, abandoning their lavish casinos and swank nightclubs, Trafficante stayed put, convinced that Castro would honor the loyalty he'd shown him. This calculated risk signaled something extraordinary, an alliance, however tenuous, with Castro that defied the other mobsters' instincts to retreat. But this alliance, like so many in the underworld, was a fragile one. For Meyer Lansky, who had poured his life into the Havana empire, the financial devastation was the bitterest pill. To Lansky, every dollar lost was a betrayal. Every casino shuttered was a slap in the face. But for Trafficante, the true sting was betrayal itself. In his eyes, he'd put his faith in Castro, a calculated trust that he felt was mutual. Instead, that trust was shattered, leaving a bitter resentment that would haunt him long after his empire was gone. For Batista, Castro's growing influence was an unbearable itch he couldn't scratch. His frustration was palpable, as his once steady composure unraveled into nervous eating, an endless cycle of self-pity, and an inability to focus. He couldn't reconcile the unrest brewing in what he saw as a golden era for Cuba's economy. His response was savage, an indiscriminate campaign of violence designed to crush dissent. In Cienfuegos, when a faction of the Cuban Navy attempted a mutiny, Batista's forces didn't just suppress them, they obliterated them. The toll was brutal. 300 lives, soldiers and civilians alike, sacrificed in a single bloody event. Batista's henchman, Senator Rolando Masferrer, led his notorious gang, Los Tigres, on a campaign of terror, their brutal work displayed in public as a warning to all. But for every youth they killed, more joined the revolutionary cause, pushing the country further towards civil war. All of this boiled outside Havana, where the mob continued as if their world was untouchable. The attack on the presidential palace should have been their wake-up call, but they trusted in Batista's iron grip to keep the storm at bay. Besides, they had their own problems to tackle as the tourist season loomed in 1957. And then, like a storm gathering on the horizon, Albert Anastasia arrived in Havana. Hurricane Albert, a force as intimidating as it was unwelcome. Dressed for New York's winter in a felt fedora, Anastasia stormed through Havana's top spots, from the Oriental Park racetrack to the Sans Souci Casino and Tropicana nightclub. He was treated like a king, yet his presence was unsettling. At the Copacabana Hotel, his behavior bordered on dangerous, loud threats, intimidating gestures, all aimed at a room that included his mob associates. Lansky, notably absent, had warned his men to respect Anastasia, though he had also made it clear that the Lord High Executioner was unwelcome in Havana. Anastasia's grievance was personal and symbolic. He had discovered that his stake in the Hilton Hotel was diluted, parceled out to a consortium that included everyone from Cuban workers to a junior senator from Nevada. While Trafficante and Lansky had their domains locked down, Anastasia found himself tangled in red tape and shared ownership. To a man like Anastasia, sharing a piece of his hard-won empire with a motley crew of laborers and bureaucrats was unacceptable. When the storm he'd stirred finally passed, there was an uncanny calm. Lansky's driver, Jaime Casieles, sensed a change in his boss. Though Anastasia's name still circulated among the mob as they gathered for meetings at Joe Stassi's house, Lansky seemed to have reached a place of eerie resolve. The worst thing that could happen to a man, Lansky had once told Jaime, was to lose his footing or let himself get knocked off balance. Stability was Lansky's creed, and Anastasia had disrupted it. According to Jaime, Lansky's approach was decisive. He didn't just sit back. He made moves to restore the equilibrium. For Santo Trafficante, Havana's storm with Albert Anastasia wasn't a headache. It was an opening, a golden chance to make a move. As the Tampa mob boss knew, the syndicate's grip on Cuba was never isolated. It was a delicate network, a high-stakes web that tied him, Lansky, Batista, and a roster of American crime families into a single, dangerous enterprise. What happened in Havana echoed back to New York, Chicago, and Tampa. Every decision made on that sun-soaked island didn't just stay there. It caused tremors throughout America's underworld. Rivalries? They were part of the territory, the friction that fueled men like Trafficante, who knew that every conflict could be spun into a power play. And this was no different. So, 2 months after Anastasia's blitz of Havana, Trafficante caught a flight back to the States, slipping into New York under his favorite alias, B. Hill. He touched down at Newark, took a cab straight into Manhattan, and checked himself into the Warwick Hotel on West 55th Street. The plan: meet with Anastasia and a handful of Cuban insiders to talk about Havana's latest prize, the Hilton Hotel's casino. Trafficante had already written to Anastasia, arranging rooms for some of his Cuban contacts and giving a quiet order. Tell Cappy to take care of these people. Cappy, Tony Coppola, Anastasia's shadow and confidant, was someone Trafficante knew well from Havana, and he could be trusted to handle the meeting's setup. At the table were key players, including Joe Rivers, an old Havana hand with a personal loyalty to Anastasia, and Robert Chiri Mendoza, a slick operator with a permanent tan, Batista's business partner, and a member of one of Cuba's old families. Chiri Mendoza had one ambition: to bring the legendary Joe DiMaggio to the Hilton, a public face to draw the crowds. DiMaggio came by to shake hands, but politely declined. He wasn't one to endorse liquor or gambling. But the casino was still the main game, and after DiMaggio left, the group retreated to Chandler's in Midtown, where the real conversation got rolling. The numbers on the table were staggering. The Hilton concession? That was going to cost a clean $1 million up front and an extra $2 million under the table to Batista. Trafficante's interest was obvious, and he needed Anastasia's cash to close the deal. A clear maneuver to bypass Lansky. The message was unmistakable. Lansky's grip on Havana was not unbreakable. Trafficante was ready to negotiate terms, and Anastasia, who knew Lansky from the Lower East Side days, understood this wasn't just business. It was a strategy to cut out Lansky's influence. What they didn't know was that another figure from Havana was quietly observing their moves. Joe Stassi, the day-to-day anchor of the Havana mob, had checked into the Park Sheraton Hotel under the name Joe Rogers. Stassi wasn't just any mediator. He was the link between Havana's factions. Men gathered at his Havana estate near the Almendares River, a tropical compound that felt like the unofficial mob headquarters, a sanctuary of power. On paper, he was a neutral ground between factions, but in practice, Stassi's loyalty belonged to Lansky. He'd once said Lansky was the smartest crook I ever knew. And in a rare moment of honesty, he admitted that it was the Jews who had given the Mafia its muscle, stating, "Without the Jews, the Italians wouldn't have gotten anywhere." To the mob, Stassi was a peacemaker. But his resume? It was blood-soaked. Years earlier, he'd put a bullet in his best friend's head on orders from above. He had done the mob's dirty work, and in his later years, he'd traded the gun for orchestration, building hit squads and plotting escapes. Stassi wasn't here to visit family. He was in New York for one reason only. Havana needed his touch, his skills to ensure the mob's reach was unbroken. Back at Chandler's, the stakes were high. Trafficante, Anastasia, and their Cuban partners sealed their deal. They agreed on the payments, and Chiri Mendoza would be the man to handle the Hilton casino. There was a sense of triumph as they shook hands and said their goodbyes, unaware that every move they made was setting off a countdown, ticking toward a future that none of them could control. The meeting may have ended with handshakes and smiles, but that peace was a facade. Beneath it, Santo Trafficante was pulling the strings, and the pieces were slowly shifting in his favor. With his long-standing relationship with Carlo Gambino, a figure he both respected and admired, Trafficante understood exactly where the tides were turning. He knew that both Gambino and Anastasia were getting older, two men of the same generation, both seasoned survivors. And yet, Trafficante sensed that one of them was pushing the boundaries too far. Anastasia's heavy-handed moves rattled the underworld's carefully balanced structure, challenging Trafficante's and Lansky's territories in ways that couldn't go unanswered. The meeting with Anastasia might well have been a farewell in disguise, as behind closed doors, the wheels of a far darker plot were already in motion. Quiet conversations were held with men like Russell Bufalino, the silent powerhouse from Pennsylvania, and Carlo Gambino himself. Trafficante assured them that the Southern Mafia was prepared to fall in line if Anastasia was taken out. Others, like Carlos Marcello from New Orleans, were brought into the fold, and the consensus was clear. Anastasia was becoming a liability, a loose cannon that needed to be reined in. Vito Genovese, with his own vendetta against Anastasia, had his reasons to join in. He knew Anastasia wanted him gone, and the feeling was mutual. Even Lucky Luciano was growing frustrated, demanding that New York's bosses convene to address the chaos. But what Luciano didn't realize was that Genovese had already made his case to the other families. Genovese had something Luciano didn't, the weight of the families on his side. In their eyes, Genovese wasn't just angling for power, he was the logical successor, the one who had put in the work and understood the bigger picture. The issue was personal for Luciano, but for the others, it was about stability and order. The signs were there. With Scalise's sudden, violent death, the underworld was shifting, and Genovese was positioning himself as the man to lead. For Albert Anastasia, the paranoia was real. He abandoned his Brooklyn home, retreating to a fortified mansion in Fort Lee, New Jersey, where he surrounded himself with high iron gates, vicious Dobermans, and a staff of men who knew their job was to protect him at any cost. Yet, despite the iron bars and guard dogs, he couldn't escape the signs. When his underboss, Frank Scalise, was shot down in cold blood while shopping for fruit in the Bronx, Anastasia knew the storm was coming. Scalise's murder was no coincidence. It was a signal. In the Mafia, taking out a boss's closest man was a clear warning, a shot across the bow that the boss himself was next. Anastasia's world was closing in, and he knew it. The conspiracy against Anastasia had been simmering for years. The attack on Frank Costello, the ambitious deals he pushed at the Havana conference, and his attempts to control New York's waterfront, all of it had fanned the flames. Genovese had moved meticulously, working from the shadows and targeting Anastasia's allies first. Joe Adonis was deported, Scalise was murdered, and in their place rose Carlo Gambino, a man with ambition to spare. At 55, Gambino was poised for a greater role, and Genovese knew it. Over years of quiet meetings, he had planted the seeds in Gambino's mind, subtly persuading him that Anastasia's removal was the only path to power. Genovese even crafted a list of grievances against Anastasia to sway the commission. He catalogued Anastasia's impulsive crimes, the killing of Arnold Schuster, the unauthorized selling of Cosa Nostra memberships, his encroachment into others' territories, and his vow to avenge Scalise. It was a calculated, damning argument, and for Gambino it made sense. But he wasn't one to get his hands dirty. Gambino approached his longtime associate Joe Profaci, the boss of a smaller Brooklyn family who despised Anastasia. Profaci accepted, passing the contract down to 3 of his most ruthless men, the Gallo brothers, known for their wild tempers and fearless attitude. As the pieces fell into place, the underworld's most infamous hit was about to be set in motion, and the execution would shake the Mafia to its core. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walked through the electrified gates of his Fort Lee mansion, unaware he was stepping into history. By midday, the Park Sheraton Hotel's barbershop on West 55th Street had become a grim theatre of fate. Anastasia, a towering figure who once commanded fear across New York, lowered himself into the barber's chair with an air of routine. "Haircut," he said, his voice steady, as barber Joseph Boccino set to work. The shop was quiet, the hum of clippers and the faint scent of hair tonic the only signs of life. It should have been just another day. Then the door burst open. Two masked men strode in, their pistols catching the light, and the air thickened with menace. "Keep your mouth shut if you don't want your head blown off," one of them barked. Anastasia, caught off guard, had barely a moment to react before the gunfire started. He leapt from the chair as bullets ripped through the air, shattering mirrors and bottles of tonic. Desperation guided his movements, but the barber's chair offered no escape. 10 shots were fired, 5 found their target. Anastasia, once a colossus of the underworld, collapsed to the floor in a pool of shattered glass and crimson. The killers vanished as quickly as they arrived, slipping into the shadows and disappearing into the BMT subway on 55th Street. Word of the assassination raced through the underworld like wildfire, and fingers began pointing almost immediately. Luciano, across the Atlantic, got the first whispers that Joe Gallo, the wild-eyed hood from Brooklyn, might have been involved. Gallo's allegiance at the time was with the likes of Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, and Joe Biondo, a triumvirate with shifting loyalties and hidden agendas. Biondo notably had once been tied to Luciano himself, but had since thrown in his lot with Vito Genovese, Anastasia's most cunning enemy. 15 years later, Gallo would meet a similarly violent end in a Little Italy restaurant, his death forever immortalized in The Irishman. The cycle of betrayal and revenge was as relentless as the underworld's hunger for power. Anastasia's assassination sent shockwaves through the mafia's intricate web. It wasn't just the loss of a boss, it was a seismic shift in the power structure. Across the Atlantic in Naples, Lucky Luciano received the news during a meeting with Inspector Andrea Speziale of the Guardia di Finanza. The inspector, polite but direct, dropped the bombshell. "The gangster I have in mind was a friend of yours, named Albert Anastasia." Luciano, blindsided, played it cool, denying any knowledge. But inside, he was reeling. He had warned Anastasia to be careful, to avoid closed spaces like barbershops where escape was impossible. How could he have been so stupid, Luciano thought. The timing, the location, it all stank of Genovese's handiwork. Back in New York, the streets buzzed with tension. Anastasia's death, coupled with the Mangano brothers' disappearance and Frank Scalise's brutal murder, signaled that a storm was brewing. Carlo Gambino, who had quietly risen to power as Anastasia's underboss, was poised to fill the void. Meanwhile, Genovese was tightening his grip, calling in allies like Russell Buffalino, and forging uneasy alliances with the Southern Mafia, the Detroit Partnership, and Chicago Outfit, and many others. Messages flew across the Atlantic between Luciano and his old allies, cryptic and laced with menace, hinting at a meeting that could change the game. Genovese, emboldened by Anastasia's death, was playing for the highest stakes. Vito summoned members of the Genovese and Luciano families for a grand assembly, a gathering meant to solidify his place at the top. But his move wasn't just about power, it was theatre. Genovese wanted to be crowned Capo di Tutti Capi, a title that would cement his legacy as the king of the underworld. Luciano, watching from afar, seethed at the audacity. "He's trying to play Messiah," he fumed, mocking Genovese's hunger for grand displays and public shows of dominance. In a world where power was built on whispers and shadows, Genovese's boldness was both his greatest asset and his fatal flaw. He was gathering his pieces on the chessboard, but every move he made echoed through the corridors of organized crime. The death of Anastasia had set the game in motion, and the endgame was fast approaching. In the hushed stillness before Genovese's infamous meeting, emissaries slipped through the shadowed alleys of Naples, seeking guidance from the enigmatic Luciano. Figures representing people like Carlo Gambino, newly anointed in power after Anastasia's violent end, made their quiet entrances. Russell Bufalino, who sent men like Red Levine. Bufalino, who was also present at the meeting between Albert Anastasia, Santo Trafficante, and members of Cuban Mafia. Bufalino was also present at the meeting with Joe Stassi. Russell was a shrewd strategist who'd once briefly taken the reins of the Anastasia family before power shifted, and Gambino was crowned boss by New York's influential players. In the dense, narrow streets, whispers of betrayal and dark schemes echoed, each move a calculated step toward a confrontation that would forever alter the underworld. Luciano, who had cautioned Gambino against Genovese's ambitions, had urged him to attend the Appalachian meeting, but not to bring an envelope, a signal of loyalty that Vito would be seeking. Gambino agreed, entering with only travel money, intending to reject Genovese's pretensions if it came to a showdown. Others, like Frank Costello, found excuses to avoid the gathering altogether, wary of the risks. Even Lansky, claiming a sore throat and fear of the cold, declined the invitation. What unfolded on November 24, 1957, was not only a pivotal underworld moment, but an omen of a world shifting beyond the Mafia's control. As mob figures gathered, the era was changing around them. The old ways of clandestine dominance, once buried deep in the societal fabric, were giving way to a new global order where America now stood at the summit. The Mafia's hold, so deeply rooted in secrecy, was about to face an existential challenge. As the stage was set for Genovese's grand assembly, the crime lords remained oblivious to the shifting sands of history. The Cold War was redrawing boundaries, and the Mafia's grasp on power was slipping, inch by inch. In these twilight moments, Luciano's own memories of the Mafia's birth and growth came flooding back. Yet, he never fully grasped the organization's transformation. Its entanglement with intelligence agencies, the CIA's covert alliances, the Mafia's corruption of unions, and its subtle manipulation of politicians. The Mafia, once an entity unto itself, had become an instrument in America's geopolitical games. Like the British had used pirates, the US government now leveraged mobsters like Lansky and Red Levine to achieve their own shadowy aims. The irony was palpable. What the Mafia had taken from society, it was now compelled to serve. In the mid-50s, Britain, an empire in decline, found new power as a banking giant, transforming remote islands into tax havens. Meanwhile, figures like Lansky saw the opportunity and turned places like the Cayman Islands and Jersey into vaults for the Mafia's illicit riches. The Mafia's influence seeped into every corner of American life, government, unions, entertainment, while Hoover's infamous denial of its existence only served to strengthen its grip. Then came that fateful day in November, as 80 of the most powerful mobsters in America descended on Appalachian, a quaint upstate New York town, for a meeting at the estate of Joseph Barbera. Men like Carlo Gambino, eager to solidify his claim to the former Anastasia empire, attended, hoping to rebrand the Luciano family as the Genovese crime family and the Anastasia family as the Gambino family. Vito Genovese's audacious goal of claiming the title Boss of Bosses hung in the air, but not everyone was on board. Sergeant Edgar Cresswell, who spotted the odd parade of limousines entering the sleepy town, swiftly mobilized. The troopers set up roadblocks as a host of urban gangsters, sticking out like sore thumbs, filed into Barbera's estate. Russell Bufalino, the meeting's mastermind, and Vito Genovese, the would-be kingpin, soon found themselves caught in the snare, and pandemonium erupted. Appalachian had turned into a Keystone Cops chase, with mobsters scrambling through the woods, fine suits caked in mud, stumbling over roots and slipping down hillsides. It was a surreal scene of disorder. Seasoned mobsters reduced to slapstick caricatures as they tripped over each other, flailed through brambles, and barely escaped the cops' grasp. The fallout of the Appalachian raid would be a hammer blow to organized crime. Major players like Sam Giancana, Joe Marcello, and Joe Civello managed to escape capture, but others were rounded up, dragged into hearings, and forced to face the blinding light of public scrutiny. Not since the Kefauver hearings had the Mafia faced exposure like this. And it was no secret who bore the blame. Vito Genovese had orchestrated the fiasco, his unchecked ambition spotlighting the underworld for all to see. It was in the quiet hills of Appalachian, New York, on a crisp November afternoon in 1957. The Mafia's cloak of secrecy was ripped to shreds, and Meyer Lansky's life would forever change. What was supposed to be a discreet gathering of America's most powerful gangsters turned into one of the greatest blunders in mob history. 65 men, ranging from aging dons to ambitious young lieutenants, were rounded up by state police in what the press gleefully dubbed a gangland convention. Their excuses were laughable, their plans left in disarray, and their empires exposed for the world to see. The setting was the sprawling $100,000 stone mansion of Joseph Barbera, a local beverage distributor with a shadowy past. On the surface, it looked like a quiet afternoon barbecue. In reality, it was a meeting that would change organized crime forever. The men who gathered that day weren't just criminals. They were the architects of America's underworld. We were just visiting a sick friend. When state troopers, led by Sergeant Edgar Croswell, surrounded the estate, the mobsters scattered like roaches caught in the light. Some bolted for the woods, others tried to flee in their luxury cars, and a few simply stayed put, resigned to their fate. The troopers, along with U.S. Treasury agents, rounded them up and began asking questions. The excuse. They were all just there to visit Barbera, who claimed to be recovering from a series of heart attacks. The story was as flimsy as the alibis they gave. Among those arrested was the infamous Vito Genovese, a man so powerful that Thomas E. Dewey once called him the king of the rackets. Alongside him were mob legends like Russell Bufalino, Santo Trafficante Jr., Joseph Bonanno, and Carlo Gambino. These were names that carried weight, men who controlled the flow of drugs, gambling, and money across the nation. Yet there they were, caught like common criminals. The full list of attendees read like a roll call of America's criminal elite. Anthony Guaricri, who was 47, Endwell, operates a dress factory. Patsy Turigiano, who was 51, Endicott, a grocery clerk with a conviction for running an illegal, still in 1950. Ignatius Canone, who was 32, Endwell, restaurant owner. Bartolo Guccia, who was 66, Endicott, small fish store operator. Joseph Barbera Jr., who was 21, Appalachian, son of the host. Emmanuel Ziccardi, 57, Endicott, shoe worker. Simone Scozzari, who was 57, San Gabriel, California, an alien who listed his home as Palermo, Sicily. Frank Zito, who was 64, Springfield, Illinois. Costenze Valenti, who was 31, Rochester, wholesale, produce businessman. Frank Valenti, 46, Rochester, brother of Costenze P. Valenti and his partner in produce. Louis Larasso, who was 31, Linden, New Jersey, construction foreman. Carmine Lombardizzi, 44, Brooklyn, trading corporation executive. Frank Maggiuri, who was 47, Elizabeth, New Jersey, construction worker. Michelle Miranda, aka Mike Miranda, who was 61, Forest Hills, Long Island, auto salesman. James Ostico, who was 44, Pittston, Pennsylvania, transportation manager. Joseph Civello, who was 55, Dallas, Texas, importer of food and liquor. Frank DeSimone, who was 48, Downey, California, attorney. Joseph Bonanno, who was 52, Brooklyn, retired. John Bonventre, who was 54, Brooklyn. James Coletti, who was 60, Pueblo, Colorado. Charles Chieri, who was 59, Palisades, New Jersey, transportation worker. Paul Castellano, who was 45, Brooklyn, butcher. Russell Bufalino, who was 54, Kingston, Pennsylvania, drapery man. Gerardo Cattina, who would become the underboss of the Genovese family, Orange, New Jersey, pony owner. Dominic Olivetto, who was 50, Camden, New Jersey. Joseph Ida, Highland Park, New Jersey, owner of an auto garage. Joseph Profazzi, 60, Brooklyn, distributor. Joseph Magliocco, 59, East Islip, Long Island. Salvatore Falcone, Utica. Angelo Ciandra, 33, Pittston, Pennsylvania, orchestra leader. Patsy Ciortino, 42, Auburn, bleach manufacturer. Rosario Mancuso, 50, Utica, concrete business owner. Sam Monachino, 63, Auburn, beer distributor. Patsy Monachino, who was 50, Auburn, owner of a beverage company. Salvatore Tonabe, who was 61, New York City, beer salesman. Joseph Rosato, who was 53, Union City. Luis Santo, aka Santo Trafficante Jr., who was 42, Havana, Cuba, manager of the San Souci nightclub. Anthony Reala, who was 61, West Orange, New Jersey, motel owner. John Scalish, 45, Cleveland, cigarette distributor. John DeMarco, who was 54, Shaker Heights, Ohio, real estate businessman. Frank Cucchiara, who was 62, Boston, Massachusetts, cheese manufacturer. Natale Ivola, who was 50, Brooklyn, garment delivery businessman. Joseph Falcone, 55, Utica, liquor store owner. Carlo Gambino, 55, Brooklyn, labor relations executive. Michael Genovese, who was 38, Gibsonia, Pennsylvania, car wash operator. Gabriel Kelly Manarino, 42, New Kensington, Pennsylvania, junkyard owner. Vincent Rao, who was 59, Yonkers, real estate mogul. Armand Rava, 46, Brooklyn, restaurant owner. Joseph Riccobono, who was 53, Staten Island. Joseph Barbera Sr., who was 51, Brooklyn, the host himself, and Vito Genovese, the infamous kingpin of New Jersey. For Luciano, watching from Italy, this was nothing less than a nightmare come to life. Reflecting on the catastrophe, Luciano raged at Vito's incompetence. What did Vito think would happen? He fumed, imagining the mobsters in Cadillacs parading down rural roads like they were in a damned procession. The empire he'd built from the ground up had, in one careless moment, been reduced to a circus by what he called Genovese's pig-headed arrogance. Alone in Naples, he felt the weight of his life's work collapsing, symbolized in the physical act of vomiting up his dinner, a purge of years of ambition and bitterness. Meanwhile, Luciano faced personal turmoil. Igea, the love of his life, was battling ominous health issues. Small lumps in her breast signaled an uncertain future. She feared the scars that surgery might leave, worried it would mar the body she had so freely and lovingly shared with Luciano over the years. The doctor urged action, but Luciano knew it would take more than persuasion to convince Igea. For him, her pain was another cruel twist in a life already filled with loss and betrayal. Back in America, the 1957 Appalachian fiasco set the stage for seismic shifts. Figures like Joseph P. Kennedy recognized the opportunity and maneuvered his sons, John and Robert, into positions of prominence on the committee investigating organized crime. It was a move reminiscent of FDR's gambit against Luciano years before, using public power to confront the mafia and ultimately propel himself to the White House. The Kennedys, like Roosevelt, would rise on the promise of breaking the mafia's grip, but this time the stakes were higher. The mafia was no longer a mere domestic force. It was now an international network, intertwined with intelligence agencies and political elites across the globe. For Vito Genovese, the humiliation was profound. He had stayed hidden in the shadows for years, a quiet force as others, like Luciano and Costello, took the public spotlight. Now his image was plastered across newspapers, exposed to a level of scrutiny he had long avoided. Worse still, His own allies looked upon him with thinly veiled contempt, knowing his ambition had cost them all. If anything, the disgrace was as damaging to his pride as it was to his reputation. And Luciano, still exiled, could only watch as the empire he built fell apart in the hands of men he considered greedy and short-sighted. In his view, Genovese's mistakes had undone years of work, leaving the Mafia vulnerable and its leaders divided.